What's up and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you're new here, then hello. My name is Erica. It is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, and obviously this incredibly aggressive stack of books sitting next to me, we are going to be getting into Sarah J. Maas's Throne of Glass series. But before we can do that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you have so kindly joined this nerdy little corner of the internet, let's roll into today's video. So before we can go full throttle on everything I want to talk about, it's probably important that I let you all know what you have signed up for in clicking onto this video, because if you don't like the sound of this, this is basically your chance to exit. Okay, I don't want people sticking around till the end and then leaving comments saying this was a total waste of my time, because I am telling you now what you could expect from the rest, however long this video is going to be. What I want to be getting into today is not a review. I'm not going to be sitting here telling you guys, is this a good fantasy series? Should you read it? How does it compare to other fantasy series? You know, I'm not going to be doing any of that. Because for you guys who are newbies, maybe you've never ever seen me before, you don't know what this channel is, I am an ancient historian. I'm technically now a public historian, though I have a degree in classics. I spent my whole life studying ancient Greek and ancient Rome from the age of 11 up until now. I've created this whole channel. And so what I want to be doing today is really pulling out all of those nods from this series. This video will be intended, therefore, for people who have read the books. If you haven't read the books, it will be pretty impossible for me to do this without ruining it. And therefore, I do encourage that group of viewers to also exit the video, because I don't want to spoil the series. I think it's really, really fun in the way that the story develops. And if I spoil it for you, it's useless. But even though I do want to focus on the ancient Greek and Roman nods throughout Throne of Glass, those are not the only mythologies that are used in the Sarah J. Maas universe. Sarah J. Maas has publicly said in many, many interviews, and she'll probably continue to say this, how many different cultures and different histories and different mythologies do actually inspire her writing. She mentions this a lot with ACOTAR as well, and when I did my ACOTAR video, I mentioned this, which you guys can watch after this if you're also curious about the ancient Greek and Roman nods in that series so far. So I do just want to let you guys know that even though I'm pulling out the small Mediterranean notes throughout these books, there is obviously always more to dive into. And therefore, same with the ACOTAR video, I want to encourage anybody who has written a blog or has written posts on this, maybe publish things on this, make TikToks about this, whatever kind of media you do that goes into the other side of the histories, cultures, mythologies, please do not be shy to leave a comment below, just so that people can then use this as sort of a jumping off point to then go and find all of the other stuff that's going on in the books, because it is just such a deep and rich fantasy world that obviously I can't cover it all myself. So now that we've got that out of the way though, it is about time that I start telling you a little bit about the Throne of Glass series. The only way that I could think to do this series was actually to just go chronologically throughout the books, because there's no real overarching story, unlike with ACOTAR, where there were clear myths that were guiding the narrative. That doesn't happen in this series. However, we do have lots and lots of subtle moments for each myth in each book. And then a lot of them are repeated because they're names of characters or they're tropes that are used, that kind of a thing. So we are just going to go chronologically, which means that we're going to start with Throne of Glass. That is the first book, of which I have two, as you can see, notes in the book. Now, the most prominent one is the use of the Theseus and the Minotaur myth, which, if you guys don't know, I'm not really going to go into that much detail of the myth itself, but we do have Theseus, who is, for all intents and purposes, an ancient Greek hero. He volunteers to be sent to the ancient island of Crete, which is a very powerful kingdom at this point in mythology, in order to essentially be lunch for this magical monster called the Minotaur. Now, the Minotaur is half man, half bull. The Cretans, the king of Crete called Minos, he's decided that because this thing is so crazy and so out of his control, that he has built a labyrinth underneath the palace there, underneath the palace of Knossos, or Knossos, you can pick. But underneath that palace is the labyrinth. And when Theseus goes to enter, he is actually spotted by the princess, who is a girl called Ariadne. Now, Ariadne falls mad in love with Theseus on the spot. She does not want the Minotaur, and also subsequently her half-brother, to murder this beautiful man. And so she gives Theseus a ball of string. And she instructs him to tie the string to one end of the labyrinth when he first enters. And then that way he will not, go over the same places in the labyrinth. He'll be able to find his way out. He'll know where he's going. He'll be able to go in, kill the Minotaur, and safely come out so that they can run off together. Now, obviously the myth continues. It does not go according to plan for the whole running off thing, but the string is used. And that's the first time in ancient Greek mythology that we see this thing pop up. It's kind of one of the most famous parts of this myth. And so obviously that means that Sarah J. Maas used it in a very, very small paragraph. So for you guys who have the books, if you want to jump to page 173, it's about halfway down. And Sarah J. Maas wrote, Kalina pushed a chair into the doorway. It wouldn't do to have it slam shut on her and leave her trapped forever. She tied a string to the back of the chair, knotting it 5 times, and held the ball in her spare hand. If she got lost, this would lead her back. She carefully folded the tapestry over the door, just in case someone came in. So if you guys that need the reminder of the context, this is the moment where Kalina is kind of exploring those inner workings of the palace at Rifthold, and she is about to come across, those ancient tombs to figure out the word keys, and all of that kind of stuff is now slotting into place. But I thought that was a really nice way of tying in an ancient mythological story without making it too obvious. And actually in the same book, we do have another little nod, not to a myth, but actually to a goddess who obviously ends up being the subject of many a myth. But this is in a Roman context, which I thought was fun because we didn't get a lot of Roman nods in ACOTAR. So to see them pop up in Throne of Glass, I was thrilled. So we can jump to page 282, 283, and you will see here that there is a goddess who is named Diana in this fantasy world. Now, Diana is, as it says on page 283, she is the huntress and protector of the young. Now, why did I point this out? Is it just because there's a goddess? Is it just because there's a goddess of hunting? It's because the linkings to the Roman names are just too obvious to ignore. Diana is obviously a nod to Diana, who is the Roman version of Artemis, in case you guys are more familiar with Greek names. So the goddess Diana functions in the exact same way pretty much as Artemis. Obviously, there are lots of little differences when it comes to these goddesses, because Rome did have a cluster of gods that were specifically theirs. I think a lot of people don't realize that, but Diana is one who does come from ancient Greece, and she too was the huntress deity. She was also the goddess of young women. She was the guider of young women, and this is actually specifically before they grow into being full-fledged women, right? So young girls, young virgins specifically, after that point, they are then tossed over to Juno, or in the ancient Greek world, they are tossed over to Hera because she is the goddess of marriage, and she then guides people from sort of the age of, okay, now you're a woman, let's push you over into this sector of life, which is how you must now basically, serve your husbands and serve the states and serve all of that kind of stuff. So those are the two in Throne of Glass, which I know seems very, very small. How am I going to make a whole video about this? We have a lot of books to go, because in book 2, in Crown of Midnight, I have one little nod, which is on page 118. Now this is a very, very small nod again. And this even is actually as far back, I think as 116 is where we first kind of see this. 116, 117, 118. As the characters are eating, we get the entrance of a bard. Now, although it's not explicitly said as a bard, it is very, very clearly inspired by the idea of a bard. So what is a bard? To have a character like Rena show up, you guys can check, by the way, that is her name. It's either Rena or Rena. This is a fantasy world. We could be pronouncing this in any kind of way. I already have so many disagreements with my friend Raven, who has been buddy reading all of this with me. So Rena or Rena, when she comes into the picture, she very clearly is supposed to emulate an ancient bard. Now, for you guys who might not be familiar with that, a bard is somebody who would be hired to entertain at dinner parties in the same way that this character is in this book. What a bard would do is a bard would show up, they would have their little instrument, which tended to be a lyre. They would sing a song, which would be an epic poem. And the most famous ones that we know would have been sung at these parties would have been the Iliad and the Odyssey. So most people in the ancient world would have actually heard about the Trojan War and the journey that Odysseus has to make in order to get home through a bard. A bard would show up, people would request, whether it be book 1, book 5, book 10, book 20, and the bard would sing for an audience. It would entertain them. It would be an epic, ancient tale for them to listen to. And like I said, that's exactly what happens in book 2. Very, very slight. Literally, if you blink, you will miss that. However, I saw it, and therefore I'm passing it on to you. Book number 3, which I did read in this order, by the way, for fans who are watching this, I read Assassin's Blade after these first 2. There's nothing in here that we haven't already discussed. But I also, side note, think that people should be reading it in this order. I really enjoyed it in this order. I liked not really knowing for the first 2 books and then getting hit with all the emotions in the third book, but that's neither here nor there. Because again, in book 4, we don't have anything new that happens in Heir of Fire that would link us to the ancient world. However, Queen of Shadows is where things start getting interesting. Queen of Shadows is the real introduction of the witches of this world. We start getting an introduction to all of these different kinds of characters that are going to show up and obviously help throughout the rest of the series, which means that we have the introduction of a character called Vesta. Now, Vesta, for those of you who don't know, is the ancient Roman goddess of the home and hearth. So she is the Roman version of the Greek goddess Hestia. However, in ancient Rome, she was so much more important. Because representing the hearth and the home obviously is important for the immediate home, right? So for people who are just existing, they had a place to live, everybody was honoring Vesta for that purpose. But in Rome, they really expanded that out to not only the Roman city, but then later the Roman Empire. So the cult practices surrounding Vesta were unbelievably important. This meant that in ancient Rome, the priestesses of Vesta were called the Vestal Virgins. And oh my goodness, I could do a whole video on them. It's not really relevant to this whole fantasy series, but by God, are they fascinating. I mean, they are some of the most incredibly important members of Roman society, but they are also literally leading one of the most important cult practices of the ancient Roman world. And you were recruited to be a Vestal Virgin around the ages of about 6 or 10 years old. You would then learn everything you needed to know about the cult. You would then learn how to honor Vesta, how to do it on such a public platform. You were told also the punishments. There were some very extreme punishments, including being buried alive. So that's what we're dealing with here. But you would learn all of that, then you would go into your practice sort of part of your life where you would actually do all the roles that Vesta needed being done in the Roman state and the Roman city and the Roman people needed to be done. And then you would enter your teacher era, and you would then teach the young ones who are coming in to the cult of Vesta. One of the things that you had to practice that was probably the most important thing was that you had to tend to the fire of Vesta, which would sit in the temple of Vesta in the city of Rome. Now, this fire had to be burning all year round. That was its literal requirement to represent how, wonderful and homey the city, the empire, the state was at whatever point we're talking about when it comes to Vesta and her cult and the Vestal Virgins. However, the fire would have to be extinguished once a year and then relit. That was just the practice. Okay, this has nothing to do with the fantasy series, I'm aware. I just went on a total digression. But Vesta is used. That's kind of Vesta in ancient history. If you guys want to know more about Vesta and about that whole cult practice in ancient Rome, let me know in the comments, because I can make a whole video about that, because it is really interesting. But one of the witches is called Vesta in Queens of Shadows. We also get a mention of the three-headed goddess when we meet the witches. Now, this is their goddess. This is what the witches worship. This is who the witches call to in this entire series. And even though it's not explicitly said, this is an obvious callback to the goddess Hecate, who would often be, or Hecate, actually I should say, lots of people say Hecate. But either way, this is an ancient Greek goddess who was often represented with 3 different heads. Now, because I just went on that tangent about the Vestal Virgins, I'm not going to bore you with all of this. Again, if you guys want more information about this, I can obviously give it to you. But what is important that you guys know, just to kind of have it make sense for the fantasy series, is that Hecate, or Hecate, was the goddess of witchcraft. I know, fun. Nice little tie there, which I just thought was really interesting to have that, even though, again, no name, nothing like that is mentioned throughout the book. But I did like how that was tapped into very subtly and used in the witches' camp throughout the series. The last thing that kind of actually really starts being a thing in Heir of Fire, but is also mentioned again in Queen of Shadows and then throughout the rest of the series, is a god that is mentioned called Hellas. Okay, so this one is a little bit difficult because the word Hellas is actually the ancient Greek word for Greece. There's a really fun fact. It has nothing to do with a deity. It has nothing to do with, especially in this series, the deity Hellas is tied to this like death of god of violent death even, but that's not the case in the ancient Greek world. It is just a word that means ancient Greek. Clearly, Sarah J. Maas saw that and was like, oh, I kind of like that they call, the country that we now know as Greece, this sort of land, as Hellas. I like that, so I'm going to use that word, but make it a dark god of death. So there's no real connection aside from the word. That's just like a little, oh, here's something that you can know, but it doesn't impact anything. I find that that's a lot of what I'm saying about this series. But that's all I have to say about Queen of Shadows. So we should move on to Empire of Storms, because that's where a lot of things actually start to get really, really interesting when it comes to these Greek mythology and ancient Roman nods. And we have a list of 4 things. I have a little post-it note on the back. And we have 4 things that I need to mention about Empire of Storms. Number 1, if you go to page 123, we have the first note of a place called Ilium, which in the book is part of the kingdom of Terrasen. And in case you didn't know, Ilium is actually our ancient word for Troy. That is actually why the Iliad is called the Iliad. It's called, the story of Troy, because the ancient word would have been Ilium or Ilion in some places, in some texts. It is oftentimes referred to as Ilion as much as Ilium, but it is still Troy. So I thought that was really fun that she decided to use that, especially because here we also get lots of little nods to that world. In particular, we get a note of the Mycenaeans, which Sarah J. Maas does specifically. You can tell she did this on purpose. She misspelt it. And that's because the real way that you spell Mycenaeans is like this. And genuinely, when I was learning this, when I was at secondary school, because I was about 15, 16 when we looked at the Mycenaeans, it was a lot of like Mycenaeans, because there are so many A's in it and you say none of them. But we have the Mycenaeans, who, as you guys know, are tied to Rolf. Rolf is one of the Mycenaeans and his people. And I just really liked that little nod to the Mycenaeans, because Mycenae, for you who don't know, is a palatial structure from ancient Greece. It was most prominent and most powerful around the time of the Trojan War. So here are some of my photos of Mycenae from when I went in 2022. It is an incredible, incredible palatial structure. It is about here on a map in case you guys want to contextualize it. And Mycenae is really famous not only for being the most prominent palatial structure from this period of time, which is Mycenaean period is like 1600 down to 1100 BC, but it is also most famous for being the home of Agamemnon in Greek mythology. And this is the place where he gets killed in the tub by his wife, Clytemnestra. So there you go. There's a nice little tie-in. Obviously, we don't have a Clytemnestra character, or we don't have an Agamemnon character, or we don't have a Trojan War. But I did like all of those little things popping up, because it kind of makes sense that you would have Ilium pop up at the same time that she would use the Mycenaeans, and all of that kind of stuff tying together. I just really like seeing those nods, and I thought they made sense at the same time. Now, we have 2 other nods to the ancient world in this book. One of them is actually not to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but I'm going to mention it anyways because we've spoken about them on the channel, which is the Akkadians. Akkadians are mentioned as some of the peoples throughout this entire fantasy world. And not that we are really, focusing on the Akkadians in an ancient way throughout this book, same with all of the notes that I've been mentioning. But I thought it was fun that we used that. I do have some videos talking about the ancient Akkadian language on the channel, Gilgamesh, for example, all of that kind of stuff if you guys want to look into that. I will link those videos in the description below. But the last one is actually a link to a Greek mythological character who, again, has nothing to do with the character that is described in the book, but is called Endymion. Now, the myth of Endymion does change from author to author, as most myths do, I guess, fortunately and unfortunately. Fortunately, because it makes it really interesting to constantly dive into him again and again, but it does make it a little bit tricky to then retell it, especially when it doesn't really have that much to do with the character, so I'm not really going to. But what you guys should know about Endymion is that he is a human character of Greek mythology, and although his story does change from ancient author to ancient author, in most versions, He's a shepherd, so he's just kind of a regular guy walking around in Greek mythology. He's a young man, and he is incredibly, incredibly handsome, so much so that the moon goddess, Selene, or Selene, depending on if you pronounce that last E or not, she falls madly, madly in love with him. In the particular story where Endymion is a shepherd, because that's also not every single version, but in that one, Zeus basically gives him an option to be young forever, but be in eternal sleep, or to be like alive and not asleep, so to be awake is what I'm trying to say, but grow old. And so Endymion in that version, he chooses the eternal sleep, and then that's why the moon sort of rises and it falls in the way that it does, because it visits Endymion every single night. However, there are versions where he's not a shepherd. There are versions where he's actually a king. So it does change. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is just an ancient character who is very interesting. In the version where he's a king, no moon goddess is involved. It's more so that Zeus is like, oh, you can have this gift of foresight so you know when you're going to die and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. Again, I don't really need to put that in the video because it's going to confuse you. It's just the name. Just the name. And if you guys want any more information about Endymion, I haven't done a video on Endymion, but I can link a lot of stuff in the description below if you guys want to further check him out. Now, going into the last two books, there is actually nothing when it comes to Kingdom of Ash that we haven't already seen. So this is the last book in the series, as you guys know, but it does mean that there's nothing new that is presented. How am I putting this down? That was a lot, Erica. So there's nothing new that is said in this one, but there is a really, really interesting ancient Roman idea that is put forward in Tower of Dawn. So I did want to read that little part for you, which is page 40. In case you guys have it, you guys can go and flick to it. Go to about 2/3 down the page, and Sarah J. Maas writes, in the land of so many gods that Eurene was still struggling to keep them all straight, at least Silber remained the same. Yet another clever thing that the Kaganate... Look, this is a problem with reading fantasy, is that you kind of read these words that you're like, what are you trying to say? And I think it's Kaganate. If you guys are pronouncing it differently, let me know in the comments. Yet another clever thing that the Kaganate had done upon patching together the kingdom and territories during their years of conquest. Keep and adapt the gods of everyone. Now, how is this an ancient Roman idea? I know that this is going to sound really alien to a lot of people, especially for those of you guys that don't study the late Roman Empire. But yes, ancient Rome, especially during the time of the Empire, they are conquerors, right? That is what is really, really important to them. However, something that the ancient Romans did that was so unique and was so different was even though they wanted to impose themselves on the landscape, right? Which is why when you go to parts of the ancient Roman Empire, you have things like the theaters, for example, the amphitheaters. All of those things are very similar and really show you within the landscape that Rome was there. However, they weren't actually that fussy about the gods that each peoples that they overthrew worshipped. So a big part of ancient Roman success during the rise of their empire was going into these places, totally destroying them, saying, don't worry guys, we've come in, we've taken over, you guys can do most of the same things, you have different laws, you got to pay us taxes, that's like a big change, but minus that, everything pretty much stays the same, including the gods that you have. No problem. We will absorb them. You can keep worshipping your gods. We love your gods. We have gods that are basically the equivalent to your gods, so they can stay. Now that part, when it comes to religion, I know a lot of people are going to look at that and be like, why is that a good thing? It was, unbelievably. All they did was absorb other gods because they were polytheistic. So adding more gods to a polytheistic pantheon isn't difficult to do. And in fact, the only time where they really, really struggled was with the Judeans, because obviously the Judeans were monotheistic. And so therefore, the Judeans, even though the Romans were very happy to absorb their idea of God, the Judeans wanted absolutely nothing to do with the weird Roman path. They were like, what is this pagan stuff that you were talking about? Absolutely not. And obviously then that falls into Christianity later on. And that is one of the downfalls of the Roman Empire. So there you go. But this idea that they have in Tower of Dawn? Yes, in Tower of Dawn is very, very ancient Roman. It was so subtle. It was such a nice nod. This idea that this kingdom was going around and saying, all of your gods are okay, don't worry. And that feeling that Eurene has, which is at least that stays the same, that would have been what a lot of the people who were conquered by ancient Rome would have been feeling too. So all in all, as you can see, it is just so subtle out here. It is just so many little nods. And that's something that I will always, always love about Sarah J. Maas's series and about fantasy in general. I'm really enjoying reading these fantasy worlds that are totally new and totally different, but still hold these little kernels of our own histories, of our own mythologies, or, you know, histories and mythologies of places that are so integral to how we have ended up where we are. And I love those little callbacks because I think that they're really wonderful ways of kind of tying in our world to this world. Obviously outside of the humanity and the characters, but just kind of grounding them in something and having all of these nice little glittering rocks here, there, and everywhere that really do pull out these ancient societies from our world here. But that's pretty much everything I have to say about Throne of Glass. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's video, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. I'll see you guys then.